We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Port on the phone. Ladies and gentlemen, it is always a huge pleasure for me to welcome one of my favorite bloggers, writers, certainly blogs for over a decade now. Oh, my God. Ladies and gentlemen, the Uber blogger and writer for Salon.com, Heather Digby Parton. Hello, Heather.
Hey, Sam.
So,
thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And I realize I think we did this last year too, where we did a look back on the year that was. It's 2015. It's a little bit earlier than normal, just because I don't know when Christmas falls and all that other stuff. But let's start with a topic that I know that you've written quite a bit about, and it there's a lot of topics actually that intersect with this. And I just did a story about this bill that they're proposing in Ohio to force women who have had abortions or miscarriages, and I don't. They're introduce it. I don't know that it's going to pass. To force those women to essentially either agree to bury or cremate their fetus. It all ties into essentially the attacks on Planned Parenthood that took place via video camera this year, as opposed to guns. There's so many different issues wrapped up in this, but it's certainly a stalwart from the right, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny because I think we've seen this, what the Democrats called the war on women in the 2012 and 24 campaigns. It's obviously not going away, this particular crusade against Planned Parenthood. And some of that, I think, has to do with the fact I've just noticed that the energy behind the Planned Parenthood and the anti-abortion movement has really ratcheted up since the marriage equality issue was resolved in the Supreme Court. I mean, not that they are resigned to it by any means, but it seems as though there is this sense, they kind of are acting like cornered animals and lashing out blindly at women's rights, and I think that has something to do with it. Maybe that even, as you say, this intersects a lot of different areas that we talk about and that we deal with in our politics and our culture. Social conservatives kind of feel like they've been set back on their heels, and they are regrouping and launching a major assault in this direction. There is some reason, I think, for them to believe, just on the basis of how fast marriage equality became a big majority acceptance among the people, and that this is the issue that continues to keep their people engaged, and which is the one where they can really focus their energies and try to actually make some progress. And as we know, they have been for the last 4 or 5 years, at least since 2010. When they won their big, midterm election in the states around the country, they have been they have been launching one assault on women's rights, and particularly reproductive rights, after another. And they've been quite successful in doing that. I mean, this has been just, chipping away at it over and over again. It's made it even to the Supreme Court, where they, have been, using these arcane laws in the various states to try and limit women's access to abortion, as in the case in Texas that was heard before the Supreme Court. So their tactics on this have been to chip away at it in the 50 states, and just try and limit it as much as possible. But this year we've seen this explosion that came out of these hoax videos that were done by this group, this sort of James O'Keefe style group. And in fact, I think they have some there are areas in which they've intersected as well.
Right.
With these hoax videos that were done by this what do they call it, Center for Medical Progress, which
And
is, too cute by half.
And we should say, like, this guy, the people involved in this video thing, they sort of like, this was a 2-year thing running, right? I mean, they started going to conferences. They started to introduce themselves as like, medical researchers and whatnot. So this is a long time coming. Let me ask you too, if you think, I mean, one of the things that I'm convinced about in terms of why we've seen such a rise of Islamophobia in this country that predates San Bernardino and even predates the Boston Marathon bombing. I think a lot of that is a function of Barack Hussein Obama, and you don't even need the Hussein part, I think, for them to for that to generate a rise in Islamophobia. I mean, we played this horrible clip from a Virginia town meeting where an Arab American was introducing the sort of the architectural plans for a mosque. And guys in the audience got up and said, "You people are terrorists. Muslims are all terrorists. And the president's ruining the country." And like as if these two sentiments necessarily came from the same sort of wellspring. And it occurs to me that both the absence of this other socially conservative issue, like you mentioned, marriage equality, but also the potential of the first woman president are driving this. That it is like, that so much of the abortion issue is a function of women's sovereignty, not just over their body when they are pregnant, but over their body in terms of like having sex, right? The idea of this sort of, you can have sex without any consequences. You're not punished at all for the sex you're engaging in. It's disgusting and wrong and morally wrong, is tied in very much to the idea that we could have our first woman president.
Oh, I think you're right about that. I hadn't actually thought about that. But now that you mention it, it does seem like the same dynamic is in play. I mean, these things are always, they kind of exist sort of, bubbling beneath the surface. But when at the prospect of the country being led by Barack Obama, the first black president, you see and they weren't allowed to completely let go of their racist id about African Americans. So there was a lot of transfer and transference between the Muslim and African American thing. And let's not forget, there is a long tradition in America of African Americans becoming Muslims and being Muslims. I mean, Muhammad Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. There's an association there.
Malcolm X.
In some. Yeah, Malcolm X. In some, sort of subterranean part of the conservative id, that there is an association there. So here you have the prospect of the first woman president, and one who is, has been associated for decades with women's rights, and certainly has been pro-choice and sort of represents all of this stuff that they are very very afraid of, to be honest. And the idea
the young ones here in this office do not remember that really her first introduction to America was her saying, "I'm not going to sit in the kitchen and bake cookies all day," and
boy,
that.
It was like she had launched a grenade into the political system when she said that. It made people so angry. It was so bad that she ended up having to offer up her personal cookie recipe to Good Housekeeping or something to prove that she did actually make cookies. And she has always been, seen as the sort of feminist succubus on the right, and an avatar of everything that they, the feminazis, as Rush Limbaugh used to say it. So within that group, I mean, it is hard to remember. Clinton's been, for young people, I think they see her as a leader, and she's been a senator and a secretary of state. But there was a time when she was the most famous woman in America for being a feminist, sellout to all of womanhood. I mean, she was the enemy of the Phyllis Schlafly's of America.
Well, she's the one who tarnished. She tarnished the idea of first lady, right?
Yes.
Right. I mean, she was not. She was the first. The first lady who would not accept the sort of the term of being a lady in the way that was perceived. And before people get too uptight, this is not an endorsement of her
No.
politics. This is who she represented to the right. And I think that's still there. And look, at the end of the day, you boil it down. When you're talking about abortion, it really is just about the idea of men not owning women's sexual parts anymore. I mean, that's basically what this all comes down to, is that women are no longer chattel for men.
And the giveaway is the birth control issue.
Right.
I mean, this happens every time. You see this. When they make any headway on the abortion issue, and all of their care and concern for the life and the personhood and the fetus, and then you drill down a little bit, and they're also against birth control, and they also are they're saying, well, this kind of birth control is, even though it's scientifically completely untrue, this kind of birth control is
abortion.
What they call abortifacient. It shows that what this really is about is sexuality, and this comes in some cases from religion. It comes in some cases from patriarchy and male, the sense that women are seeking equality and becoming they're no longer they're sovereign humans.
Right.
Who are actually running their own lives and making their own decisions, and they consider that a threat to the family, the basic unit of human organization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this is all tied in together, and what I see is kind of on the right in terms of this Planned Parenthood thing, which, by the way, they are not giving up. If anybody thinks that the Planned Parenthood assault in the Congress is going away, think again, because it is not going away. They are still going. They're going to have some show trials next year on Planned Parenthood. There's going to be, they've got this special select committee run by a bunch of Republican women who, and they call it something like, the Committee for the Sanctity of the Infant Child, or something insane like that. It's ridiculous. And so this is not going to go away. This is going to go all the way into the fall. And it's kind of, I think I get the sense among Republican strategists that they're actually fairly nervous about it. It hasn't worked out well for them in the past few cycles. I mean, this has not been a winning strategy for them. But I think they believe that they have no choice. The social conservatives are demanding this,
right.
And that's a big chunk of the Republican electorate, and there's no getting around it. They're going to have to do something, put on some kind of a show, and they'll try. They'll see if they can just bluster about and not actually do anything. But who knows how it's going to go. And in the meantime, it's really awful. Let's just say,
right.
Put that out there. It's a terrible thing.
And more broadly speaking, I mean, this is the basic dilemma. And I want to. We got a couple other things to hit here, but maybe this is a good time to sort of pivot into the whole right-wing phenom for the year. And we could actually even tie in gun violence, I think, into this too, to some extent. I mean, that's the thing, is that, when we start to talk about these things, you start to realize, folks, that these things are all interrelated. We end up talking about these things as separate issue silos in some way. But there is a threat that I think that the people on the right feel, and the ascendancy of a woman to the presidency, or the prospect of it, I think is terrifying, because that is sort of like, at least symbolically, and even more so, I think it's going to have. I think it's even going to be more. It's going to have more impact. I mean, to the extent that there was symbolism in the first African American president. There was, and clearly, and we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter. Clearly, the implications for the black community were not, I would say, I mean, they were positive, I think, in terms of there's the imagination was was released in some way, but in terms of things on the ground, in terms of like the way that culture has changed, if anything, things seem to go backwards a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's not going to be that way with a woman because you've got 50% of the population. And I think that there's going to be Hillary Clinton is running this time anyways, not shying away from the fact that she's a woman, right? Like in the last election, it was don't be motherly, don't bring up your kids, don't, talk about being,
right.
But I think that she's embracing it more this time. And I just think that this is a signal to society that, like, look, this dynamic is dying. The women were 30 years out, and in some states, maybe only 10 or 15 from women not being chattel for their husbands. But this is ending. This is, so there's a panic there. This also, with the dynamic that the right wing, and I think you and I have watched this, and you pay attention to what's going on the right in a way that I think a lot of people who write as liberals don't, and particularly in sort of like mainstream publications, and what was marginal 15 years ago is now seems to be basically the center of the Republican Party, both in terms of like issues, but more like even more in terms of just power, electoral power, right? And so we see these hearings happening, which are only going to sort of heighten the implications and the importance for single women who may go out and be the biggest constituency that Hillary Clinton is going to be able to deliver.
Well, I think so, and I suspect that there are plenty of smarter Republicans out there. They are in a minority at the moment, but they do still exist. That they understand that it's a very risky thing, and in fact, even in one of the the reports recently, you probably recall where they were talking about how to co-opt the Trump phenomenon. What they were kind of saying, well, he's got his finger on the pulse of the Republican electorate, and follow his lead in terms of this, that, and the other. But the one thing they said wasn't a good idea was to go after women, and to not follow him on that. That's kind of off limits. That will not happen, and it can't happen. And in fact, you see it with Marco Rubio, the alleged establishment it boy, who is flailing around madly, trying to move right as fast as he can. And one of the ways that he did it was by saying that he would not support a right to that he supports banning abortion only in the case of threat to the life of the mother, whereas the mainstream position up until very recently, was that there was an exception for rape and incest too. That is now eliminating that exception is now a mainstream establishment Republican position, and it's outrageous. I mean, incest. Essentially, these Republicans, mainstream establishment Republicans, this isn't Mike Huckabee or Rick Santorum or some other, super social conservative. This is Marco Rubio, who says that a girl, a 13-year-old girl should be forced to bear her father's child.
And look, that question, it's almost, honestly, with these debate moderators, it's possible that question would not come up, but it would be incredible malfeasance. I mean, in a debate, if Marco Rubio is the Republican nominee, the idea that he's got to answer that question in front of the American public. Are you going to force a 15-year-old, 14-year-old girl who has been raped by her father or her uncle to carry that pregnancy to term? He's got to answer that question in public. It's impossible for me to imagine that he doesn't get that that doesn't, I mean, if nothing else, right, that stops everybody in their tracks.
I would think so. I would certainly hope so. That
Right.
is not a majority view, by the way. I mean,
No.
in fact, the public opinion on abortion rights has been almost, flatlined since the 70s. That no minds have been changed one way or the other. A majority of Americans support abortion rights, some with limitations, a much smaller faction without any limitations, and there is a hardcore group who support banning abortion in all cases. For the most part, Americans are much more humane about this issue than the politicians on the right are, and their social conservative voters. I don't think that people, if they hear a mainstream politician like Marco Rubio say that a 14-year-old girl has to bear her relatives, bear her own sibling, that they are going to find that to be a humane and decent policy. I just don't think that most Americans think that way. And by the way, everybody should keep in mind that a third of American women in their lifetimes have an abortion, and that's many, many millions of women.
Right.
And as we get further to the right on this, and this is happening all over the country as well, laws are being passed that are making women criminal for things like self-induced abortion. There was just one this past week where a woman was arrested for a self-induced abortion. Abortion is legal; it's a constitutional right, and they are saying that she harmed her fetus by trying to have an abortion. That is getting very, very close to criminalizing women for abortion, and it is getting very close to forcing these people to admit the fact that they consider women, millions and millions of women to be murderers. I don't think that's tenable. I don't think the vast majority of people in this country think that. But it's starting to become clarified.
Yep.
God knows, I hope that this is clarifying in a way that works for women and not against them. You never know how that's going to go, but I guess I remain an optimist that we're not the kind of country yet that wants to criminalize millions of women. Hopeful.
And I think, just sort of pivoting here a little bit, I think the loss of homophobia as an electoral sort of like organizing force, which is not to say that homophobia is gone. It's just that the Republican Party they've lost their mojo on this issue.
Yep.
And it has transferred, I think, both to the question of women's sovereignty and also into sort of xenophobia. And once you start getting into, and even like, if you break down, because, the Trump Cruz Carson sort of appeal here, it is, in my estimation, it is, and the Carson is different, I think, in some ways from Cruz and Trump in particular. But he raises this too. It is the whole anti-PC thing. And what is PC but sort of a recognition, but the opposite of xenophobia and the notion that women are people too?
Yep.
Right? I mean, 90% of what they would complain was PC is criticism of xenophobia, racism, and misogyny. I don't even know what the other 10% is. Maybe it's all 100%. Maybe I'm forgetting something. And this is, that to me seems to be the number one organizing principle of the conservative movement. I mean, I was on, I don't even know what show it was on MSNBC. They don't even have names for them anymore, I think. But it was with the libertarian guy, Matt Welsh, I think his name is. And, he was saying, but Donald Trump, he doesn't have, conservative policy. Yes, he does. He's an a-hole who's basically a nativist. That is the organizing principle, right? It's like this anti-PC. They don't care about his Medicaid. Well, they probably care about him protecting Medicare and Social Security, but they don't care about the intricacies of any policy, as far as I can tell, as long as it basically follows and adheres to that notion of, brown people are not white people, and B, If you criticize me for saying that, it's you who is being bigoted, which is the anti-PC thing. And then there's a sort of overlay of republicanism, which is I'm a billionaire, so I'm necessarily right. And that's it. You know, like I'm right morally, I'm right. I know more than any of the government stooges, blah, blah, blah. And that's Trump. And that's really the Republican Party in many respects now.
Oh, absolutely. And it's neat how Trump kind of encapsulates all of that, you know, because you think of him, he's got this populist appeal, you know, or some of us might call it a fascist appeal.
Right.
But, you know, he's the leader of the everyman, right? And yet, of course, he's a billionaire, which in America is considered, you know, that among Republicans, that has been pounded into their heads over and over again, that great wealth is kind of a sign of moral superiority, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's like the Pope.
That you are,
he's like the Pope.
Yeah, he's like the Pope. He's a billionaire. Of course, he's the greatest.